I sat stunned, the cold sting of red wine dripping down my face as laughter in the restaurant died into silence. Across the table, my daughter-in-law leaned back with a smirk, her cruel words still cutting through the air. "You deserve this." My son didn't defend me, not a word. After years of sacrifice, of love, of holding this family together, I was left humiliated. But what she didn't know was that I would erase her from everything she thought was hers, starting with my will. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Margaret Caldwell stepped into the grand candlelit restaurant, her heels clicking against the polished floor, an elegant navy dress hugging her frame. She walked in with her son, James, and his wife, Victoria. The anniversary dinner meant to be a rare moment of family celebration, but Margaret could feel the tension before they'd even reached the table. Victoria, always eager to claim control, made a beeline for the head of the table, leaving Margaret to sit across from her, a subtle act of dominance that didn't go unnoticed. The moment they were seated, Victoria didn't waste any time. "This place is perfect for me, don't you think, James?" Her voice was sugary sweet, her eyes scanning the room as though she owned it. Margaret didn't respond, simply sitting tall in her chair, trying to maintain peace. James, her son, glanced between them, awkwardly shifting in his seat. "So, Mother," Victoria continued, her eyes glinting with a mix of curiosity and condescension, "you've always been so old-fashioned, haven't you? Holding on to all those outdated values. It's fascinating, really. I'm surprised you haven't updated your lifestyle by now." Margaret felt the sting of the words, but she simply sipped her wine, keeping her expression composed. She'd been through worse from Victoria, who always seemed to feel the need to remind her of how out of place she was in modern times. "Times change, Margaret," Victoria added, her voice laced with subtle mockery. "You wouldn't understand, of course. You've always been about tradition." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she remained silent, letting the words bounce off her. She had learned to pick her battles, and tonight was supposed to be about James and Victoria. But Victoria didn't stop. "I don't know how you put up with all this," she continued, a casual air of superiority in her tone. "It must be exhausting. Living like you're still in the past." Margaret's hands clenched around her glass, the cold stem grounding her. She forced a tight smile. "I've never been exhausted by what I believe in." Victoria's gaze flicked toward her, and for a moment, there was a shift in the air. Then, without warning, Victoria leaned forward, her eyes narrowing in an all-too-familiar way. Margaret didn't have time to brace herself before Victoria suddenly stood and flung her wine across the table, the red liquid splashing against Margaret's face. The glass shattered in a brilliant arc, and a few droplets hit the pristine tablecloth, like bloodstains on snow. The restaurant fell dead silent. Margaret sat frozen, the wine slowly dripping down her cheeks, the hum of the restaurant replaced by the deafening sound of her pulse in her ears. She blinked, stunned, the taste of bitterness lingering on her lips. The world around her was quiet, but inside, a storm raged. Victoria's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You deserve this," she sneered, leaning back in her chair as though the spectacle was nothing more than a trivial joke. The silence stretched, suffocating. James, who had been too quiet, shot to his feet. "Victoria, what the hell is wrong with you?" His voice was strained, the words coming out too late, too weak. He looked at his mother, his face pale, but there was no genuine anger, only a fractured sense of confusion. Margaret remained still, wiping her face with the napkin, her hands shaking as she fought to regain control. The humiliation was sharp, stinging, but she wasn't going to let it break her. Not here, not in front of everyone. "I'm done," Margaret said, her voice soft but firm, the years of composure holding her steady. She stood slowly, her back straight, and walked out of the restaurant. The cold night air hit her like a slap to the face, but it did little to calm the fire in her chest. She could hear the faint murmurs behind her, but she didn't turn back. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. With shaky fingers, she typed a brief message. Time to erase her. She hit send, and her heart pounded with a quiet satisfaction. It was over, no more tolerance, No more playing nice. Victoria had crossed the line, and Margaret would make sure she paid the price. The cold wind of the Charleston night wrapped around Margaret like a harsh reminder of the evening's events. She could still feel the sting of wine soaking into her skin, the humiliation pressing against her ribs. But as she stepped into the foyer of her stately home, she didn't let the emotion of it take hold. Instead, a sharp focus settled over her, an icy clarity that pushed everything else aside. James had stayed behind at the restaurant, trying, futilely, to calm Victoria. But Margaret wasn't interested in listening to their apologies or explanations. No, tonight had been the final straw. She had always been patient with Victoria's cruelty, but this was different. The glass had shattered, but it wasn't just the wine spilling over her dress. It was the years of manipulation, of passive-aggressive comments, of disrespect. Tonight had revealed who Victoria truly was, and Margaret wouldn't stand for it any longer. She slipped out of the ruined dress, the fabric heavy and saturated with red wine, and stepped into a soft robe. The sound of the silk against her skin was a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts in her mind. Margaret moved methodically, her movements calculated, her heart steady with resolve. Her fingers hovered over her phone as she paced the marble floors of her home, the echo of her footsteps deepening the silence. Finally, she dialed Kenneth's number. The phone rang 3 times before his deep voice answered. "Margaret," Kenneth said, his voice calm, expectant. "I need you." Margaret's voice was low, controlled, but with a firmness that couldn't be mistaken. "I need you to make sure Victoria is erased from the will, completely." There was a slight pause on the other end, a moment where Margaret could almost hear the hesitation in Kenneth's breath. He knew Margaret well enough to understand when her mind was set. "Are you sure, Margaret? This is permanent. Once the changes are made, there's no going back." "I'm sure," she replied, her voice colder than it had been all night. "She's crossed the line. No more tolerance. I want her name off the documents. No inheritance. Nothing." Kenneth let out a quiet sigh, the kind that signaled the weight of the decision. "I'll begin the revisions right away, but you understand the consequences, don't you? This will change everything." "Let it change everything," Margaret said with finality, her mind already ahead of the curve. "It's time. She thought she could insult me. I'll make sure she never gets the privilege of being part of my legacy." Margaret could feel her fingers tightening around the phone, her grip tightening with a newfound strength. This wasn't just about money, it was about respect, something Victoria had proven she would never give. And now, Margaret was taking control. She wasn't about to let this woman stain her legacy, her family's legacy, with her entitlement and cruelty. Kenneth paused for a long moment before responding. "I'll make the changes, Margaret. It'll be done. I'll have the documents prepared for signature tomorrow." Margaret nodded, even though he couldn't see it. "Make sure you leave her name off completely. Replace it with no one." "Understood," Kenneth said, his tone now firm, final. "It's as if she never existed in your will." Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision settle in. "Do it. It's done." "I want it permanent." "You have my word," Kenneth replied, the resolve in his voice matching hers. She ended the call with a sharp tap, slipping the phone into her pocket. The house felt still, too still, as if it too were holding its breath. Margaret stood in the center of the living room, staring out over the garden that stretched beyond her windows. Her reflection in the glass was a woman at peace, calm yet unyielding. This was the end of a chapter and the beginning of something new, something that would not be tainted by the likes of Victoria. Just as she turned to head upstairs, Kenneth's voice broke through again. "Margaret, it's done. The changes are made. You've made it permanent." For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. She stood there, letting the weight of those words sink in. Victoria had no idea what she'd just done. Margaret was about to ensure she'd never get another chance to disrespect her again. The house felt quiet, too quiet, but Margaret knew one thing for certain. She had just taken control of her own legacy. And there was no going back. The thick air of the law office pressed in on Margaret as she sat across from Kenneth, the man who had been her trusted lawyer for years. The soft murmur of the city beyond the office windows felt distant, irrelevant. In this room, only one thing mattered: the finality of the decision she had made. Kenneth slid a thick stack of papers across the desk to her. The crisp sound of the pages shifting was almost deafening in the quiet room. Margaret's fingers hovered over the top sheet, the weight of her actions finally sinking in. This wasn't just about a will, it was about severing ties, cutting away the poison that had slowly seeped into her family for years. Victoria had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Margaret picked up the pen and signed the document with a steady hand, her signature sharp and deliberate, each stroke representing the severing of the last thread of loyalty she'd held for her daughter-in-law. "She's out, completely," Margaret said, her voice cold but firm. Kenneth, who had watched her in silence, leaned back in his chair. His eyes were a mix of admiration and caution, a careful balance that he always carried when it came to Margaret's decisions. He had always respected her strength, but even he could sense the gravity of what she had just done. "Are you sure this is what you want?" he asked, his voice measured. Margaret didn't hesitate. Her gaze didn't falter as she looked at the papers before her. "She doesn't deserve a penny after what she did." The words were final, unshakable. There was no second-guessing, no wavering. The insult Victoria had thrown at her, the whine, the sneer, the complete lack of respect, was unforgivable. Margaret had spent years biting her tongue, tolerating Victoria's manipulations, but now that was over. The time for tolerance had passed. Kenneth nodded, but his brow furrowed as he adjusted his glasses. "I understand, but Margaret, this might cause complications down the line. James will eventually find out, and when he does..." Margaret cut him off, her voice cool and unwavering. "He'll find out when he sees the final papers." The decision had been made, and there was no turning back now. She had put up with James's indecisiveness for too long. If he couldn't stand up to his wife, then he didn't deserve her protection. She had lived her life with grace, with dignity, but there were some things that could never be forgiven. Victoria had shown her true colors, and Margaret would no longer allow her to be part of the family's legacy. Kenneth looked at her closely, the depth of his understanding clear in his eyes. "I'll file everything as soon as possible. We'll make sure it's done properly. No one will know until the will is read. We can wait to inform James until then." Margaret paused for a moment, the weight of the decision settling over her like a thick fog. Her mind was clear now, but it wasn't an easy path. "Do it, Kenneth," she said softly. "No one gets to disrespect me like that." Kenneth sighed, but it was a sigh of resignation, not concern. He had known Margaret for too long to question her resolve. "It's done," he said, nodding as he made a note in the file. "The documents are filed. The deed is done." Margaret didn't smile, didn't react with relief. Instead, she felt an odd sense of peace settle over her. It was the peace that came with knowing she had taken control. Victoria had underestimated her, but Margaret was always 3 steps ahead. No one would ever disrespect her again, least of all a woman who had tried to destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. As she stood to leave, Margaret looked at Kenneth one last time. "I want to make sure she never gets a cent," she said, her voice low and resolute. "Her entitlement ends now." Kenneth nodded, though there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, perhaps admiration, perhaps a silent acknowledgement that this was a decision that would ripple through the family forever. "It's all in your hands now, Margaret." With that, Margaret turned and walked out of the office, the door clicking softly behind her. The sound was like the closing of a chapter, a definitive end to a painful era. She stepped into the quiet streets of Charleston, the weight of the city's historic buildings towering above her, but for once, she felt lighter. The pieces were falling into place, and nothing would ever be the same again. As she walked away, her phone buzzed in her purse. She didn't need to check it. She already knew that the storm was just beginning. And soon, Victoria would feel the full force of Margaret's decision. The phone rang, its sharp sound slicing through the stillness of Margaret's quiet home. The night had settled in, the city outside bathed in the warm glow of streetlights. But inside, Margaret remained focused, her mind still sharp from the events of the previous night. She had expected this call, had known it was coming. Victoria always believed she could smooth things over with a few choice words, always thought she could manipulate her way back into Margaret's favor. Margaret picked up the receiver, her fingers cold against the smooth plastic. She didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. "Margaret, I need to talk to you," Victoria's voice crackled through the line, sounding soft, almost hesitant. But Margaret wasn't fooled. She could hear the rehearsed sincerity in Victoria's tone, the same false sweetness that had dripped from her every word at the restaurant. Margaret said nothing, waiting for Victoria to continue. She had already heard all the excuses, all the justifications, and she wasn't in the mood for them now. I want to apologize for what happened last night," Victoria continued, her voice smooth but strained. "I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand. You know how James can be, and I was just frustrated. He doesn't listen to me. You don't understand what it's like to be married to him." Margaret's grip tightened on the receiver, her pulse steady but her heart colder than it had been in years. "Oh, I understand more than you think," she replied, her voice low, steady, and completely devoid of warmth. Victoria faltered for a moment, as if caught off guard by Margaret's response. "Look, I didn't want to hurt you," she said quickly, her tone shifting now, veering into the realm of guilt. She paused, as though searching for the right words. "You're old-fashioned, Margaret. You don't understand how hard it is to keep up with everything. I've got so much on my plate, and Margaret's patience, always a pillar of strength, was beginning to erode. She had heard it all before, the endless excuses, the manipulation. It was the same song she had listened to for years, but this time, the tune was different. Victoria had crossed a line that couldn't be erased with empty words. "Old and out of touch," Victoria repeated, as if the words might work some kind of magic. "You've got to admit, you're not as in tune with how the world works anymore. James and I were trying to build something, but it's so hard when—" Margaret cut her off, her voice cutting through the noise. "You're no longer part of my will. That's all you need to know." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end. Victoria's breath caught, and for the first time, Margaret could hear her fumbling, unsure of what to say next. "What?" Victoria gasped, her voice sharp and incredulous. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm serious," Margaret said, her voice calm, even though she could feel the weight of her decision settling into her chest. "I've made my choice. You insulted me in front of everyone, and now you'll see the consequences." Victoria's voice trembled slightly. "But Margaret, this is family. You can't just—" "It's already done," Margaret said, cutting her off with a finality that left no room for argument. "You will no longer benefit from anything I've worked my entire life to build. Not a single penny." Margaret's words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, and for a brief moment, Margaret wondered if Victoria was truly processing what she had just heard. Then the line went cold. Victoria gasped, her breath shaky and sharp, the sound of her inhalation almost as loud as the silence that followed. Margaret waited, unmoved, as the seconds stretched on, each one like a drumbeat counting down to something inevitable. Finally, a click echoed through the receiver. The line had gone dead. Margaret stared at the phone for a long moment, the words still echoing in her mind. The deed was done. Victoria was out. Completely. And the silence that followed was somehow more deafening than any scream. Victoria didn't believe Margaret's words, not for a second. When the phone call ended, Victoria sat there for a long time, the silence wrapping around her like a comfort. She laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Margaret was always dramatic, always trying to pull some kind of power move, but Victoria was too smart to fall for it. Margaret had made plenty of threats over the years, but this one would blow over. She always did. The wine-throwing incident was nothing but a passing storm. No way Margaret would cut her off completely, not after everything they'd been through. The next morning, Margaret's lawyer, Kenneth, arrived at her doorstep with a letter in hand. It was simple, clean, and to the point. Victoria Caldwell is officially disinherited from the will. Margaret had made it official. The ink was barely dry when Kenneth left, his eyes unreadable as he handed over the sealed envelope to Victoria's home. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, staring at the letter she had sent. She could almost picture Victoria's face as she opened it. Margaret felt a strange sense of finality, an unexpected weight lifting from her shoulders. She had done it. There was no going back now. A few hours later, the phone rang again. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" James's voice was frantic, laced with confusion. Why would you do this to Victoria? She's family. You can't just… Margaret cut him off, her voice cool but firm, her words sharp like glass. She insulted me, James. And now she's paid the price. There was a silence on the other end of the line, as though James were struggling to find the words. This is a family matter, Mom. You can't just… I don't want to hear it, James, Margaret said, her voice unwavering. I've made my decision. You don't get to change it. This is the consequence for her actions. James tried again, desperation creeping into his tone. But this is going too far. She's been under a lot of pressure, Mom. You've got to understand. No, Margaret interrupted, her voice steady and resolute. I won't tolerate disrespect. Not from her, not from anyone. And if you can't understand that, then you're no better than she is. The line went quiet again. Margaret could hear the faint sound of James's breath on the other end, but he didn't speak for several moments. Then, with a defeated sigh, he said, I don't know what to say, Mom, but this is going to destroy the family. Margaret's words were ice cold, but they were final. Then let it destroy itself. I'm done. She hung up the phone without another word, the silence settling in around her like a fog. James's pleas echoed in her mind, but she wasn't wavering. This was about respect. This was about power, and no one, least of all Victoria, was going to take that from her. As the day wore on, Margaret watched as the calls and messages trickled in. Victoria's family, her friends, even distant relatives, all contacted her, but not with concern. No, it was all judgment. They were questioning her actions, calling her cold, accusing her of losing her mind. Victoria was feeding them all her lies, painting Margaret as a bitter old woman losing touch with reality. Margaret didn't flinch. She had made her choice, and she would not be swayed by their whispers. Later that afternoon, she sat in her study, sipping tea, when her phone rang again. This time, it was Kenneth. His voice was different, more serious. Margaret, you need to listen. Victoria's lawyer just called. They're filing a petition to contest the will. They're not backing down. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she sat up straighter, her fingers gripping the phone as her mind raced. Of course they would fight back. Victoria wouldn't just take this lying down. I thought this was done, Margaret said, her voice steely. It's not, Kenneth replied. They'll fight this in court, and they might make it ugly. You're not just dealing with an upset daughter-in-law now. They'll go for your entire estate. Margaret's heart tightened, but she remained unshaken. Let them, she said simply. Let them fight. I'll be ready. But as she hung up, a strange feeling crept into her chest. This was just the beginning. Victoria would stop at nothing to claw her way back into the family's fortune. And Margaret was about to show her exactly what happens when you underestimate her. Victoria didn't waste any time. The ink on the revised will was barely dry before she made her move. Her lawyer wasted no breath in filing a formal petition, claiming that Margaret had used undue influence over her son James to disinherit her. The nerve, the audacity. Margaret, sitting in her study the next morning, read the petition with a quiet, simmering fury. The words on the page were a blatant lie, an insult to everything she had built. Undue influence, she muttered, shaking her head. It was laughable. Victoria had overplayed her hand, and Margaret had no intention of letting her get away with it. James, of course, was caught in the crossfire, playing his usual role of peacemaker, unable to see the full extent of his wife's manipulation. He didn't understand the stakes, the venom that Victoria was willing to unleash. He called her a few hours later, his voice strained and apologetic. Mom, what's going on? Why are you letting this go this far? James asked, frustration clear in his tone. This is a family matter. You can't just turn your back on her like this. Margaret sighed deeply, the sound heavy with exhaustion. James, she said, her voice steady but firm. I didn't turn my back on her. She turned her back on me first. She insulted me, James. She humiliated me in front of everyone. And now she's trying to undo the consequences of her actions. This isn't just about money, it's about respect. James didn't reply immediately, but she could hear him on the other end, his thoughts swirling. I know, Mom, but… No, James, Margaret interrupted, her patience thinning. You don't know. I've tolerated her behavior for years. This is not about money. It's about her never being able to get away with treating me like that again. Do you understand now? There was silence on the line. Margaret could feel the weight of his hesitation, the pull between his loyalty to his wife and the nagging guilt he must have felt about the way his mother had been treated. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter now, more resigned. I get it, Mom, but I still think you're going too far. She's family. You should have thought about that before she threw wine in my face, Margaret replied, her tone final. She hung up before he could say anything more. There was nothing left to say. Later that day, she met with Kenneth, her longtime lawyer. The scent of leather and wood filled the air of his office as she sat across from him, the weight of her decision sitting heavy in the silence between them. She placed the petition on the desk, her fingers brushing over the paper briefly before she looked up at Kenneth. They're challenging the will, she said simply, her voice calm, collected. Kenneth took the papers, scanning them quickly before meeting her eyes. I saw. They're claiming undue influence. They're not wasting any time. Margaret's lips curled into a faint smile, the kind of smile that held no warmth. Let them try. They don't stand a chance. Kenneth's expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes that showed he understood the depth of Margaret's resolve. They'll try anything to overturn this, he warned. This could get ugly, Margaret. You're dealing with a woman who doesn't know how to lose. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the desk. I know, she said, her voice sharp, unwavering. But I'm not worried. The will is legally sound. They're wasting their time. Kenneth nodded slowly, but Margaret could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. You need to be prepared for what's coming, he said. They won't go down easily. Margaret's gaze hardened. I'm prepared. This is about more than money, Kenneth. It's about respect. And I'm not going to let her tear apart everything I've built for my family just because she feels entitled to it. Kenneth sighed, leaning back in his chair, his hands steepled together. You're right, and I'll be here to fight it every step of the way. But you should know, they're not going to back down. They'll drag this out. Margaret stood, her posture tall and resolute. Let them. I'm not afraid. Kenneth's voice softened, his eyes thoughtful. We'll be ready for whatever they throw at us. Victoria thought she could bluff her way through it. She believed her high-profile lawyer and their glossy rhetoric would be enough to intimidate Margaret, enough to make her back down. But she underestimated one thing, Margaret's resolve. The first public volley came in a slickly worded press release. Victoria and her lawyer painted Margaret as a woman who had lost her grip on reality, a fragile widow too old and out of touch to handle the family estate. She's completely out of her mind, the lawyer had claimed. She's clearly unable to manage her assets anymore. This is a tragedy. The words were like a slap in the face. Margaret's name was being dragged through the mud, portrayed as a woman desperate to cling to the last vestiges of power. But what Victoria hadn't counted on was Margaret's quiet fury, the calm that came before the storm. James, as expected, remained neutral in the public eye, his words carefully measured, not fully understanding what was at stake. This is just a misunderstanding, he told reporters, his face set in that same apologetic look he had worn since the beginning. My mother and Victoria, they'll work things out. This is a family matter. We're just trying to keep things civil. Margaret couldn't help but watch him from her own home, the television screen flashing images of his pained face. There was nothing civil about this. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an attack. She felt the tension in her chest tighten as her son stood in the middle, incapable of seeing how deeply his wife had hurt her. He would have to see the truth soon enough. Meanwhile, Kenneth was on the offensive. He was no stranger to high-stakes legal battles, but this case had become personal. Margaret had always trusted him, but now, with the public smear campaign and Victoria's audacity, Kenneth worked tirelessly behind the scenes to prepare a counterattack. He was gathering every shred of evidence, texts, emails, even family statements, that showed Victoria's long-standing manipulation. He wasn't just going to defend Margaret's will. He was going to bury Victoria's lies under the weight of truth. Margaret, for her part, didn't waste time with the media circus. She spent her days meeting with Kenneth, going over the evidence he had gathered, But when she wasn't in meetings, she found solace with Grace, her longtime best friend. They sat together on Grace's back porch, the smell of blooming magnolia drifting through the air, the sky a soft lavender as dusk settled in. "They think they can destroy me," Margaret said, her voice low as she stared into the darkening sky. "But they've already destroyed themselves. Their lies are so transparent, they'll only bury themselves deeper." Grace, never one to mince words, nodded sharply. "People can only hide the truth for so long, Margaret. They'll see Victoria for who she really is. She's already ruined her own reputation by pulling this stunt." Margaret's lips curved into a thin smile, a wisp of satisfaction in her expression. "That's right. I'm just making sure the world sees it for what it is. A woman so entitled. She thinks she can get away with anything." Grace's gaze softened, the lines on her face deepening with understanding. "You've got this. Don't let them wear you down." Margaret's voice was steel as she replied, "I won't. I'm not letting her destroy everything I've worked for. Not now. Not ever." It was then that Kenneth called. Margaret picked up the phone, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. "Margaret," he said, his voice measured but with a hint of relief. "We have a court date. It's set. It's time." Margaret stood, walking toward the window of Grace's home, the evening air cool against her skin. She felt a rush of adrenaline surge through her. This was it, the beginning of the end. "Good," she replied, her voice calm but resolute. "Let's finish this." The call ended, and Margaret took a deep breath, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and determination. This was her battle, and she was ready to fight. Every move, every argument Kenneth had crafted, every piece of evidence, they were all leading to this moment. Victoria's lawyer began his argument with all the emotional weight of a man who knew how to sway the room. He spoke in a smooth, almost theatrical voice, carefully choosing his words to paint Margaret as a woman on the edge of losing everything: her mind, her control, her legacy. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," he began, his voice dripping with sympathy, "this case is not just about a will. This is about a mother who has been manipulated by a woman desperate to cling to power. Victoria Caldwell has always been a loving daughter-in-law, but Margaret Caldwell, unfortunately, has allowed herself to be swayed by her own bitterness and resentment." Victoria sat beside him, her back straight, but her hands trembling slightly. She avoided looking at Margaret, her gaze fixed firmly on the table in front of her. The courtroom was heavy with expectation, every eye on the pair as Victoria's lawyer continued. "This is a story of a woman who cannot handle the weight of her own legacy," he continued, his tone softening as he played the sympathy card. "She has allowed her grief and her isolation to cloud her judgment, and in doing so, she's hurt the people who have always supported her." The words hung in the air, thick and charged, as if everyone in the room was supposed to believe them. But Margaret wasn't so easily swayed. She sat with her hands folded in front of her, her back straight and her eyes sharp. She didn't flinch, didn't react. She was used to the manipulation, used to people trying to twist the truth for their own gain. James sat beside his wife, his expression unreadable. His eyes were cast down, avoiding Margaret's gaze as if he couldn't bear the weight of the situation. His discomfort was palpable, the strain between him and his mother visible in the tension of his posture. He didn't understand what was happening, but the truth was slowly becoming clear to him. He hadn't fully seen how deep the manipulation went. Now, as Victoria's lawyer spun his web of lies, James seemed lost, uncertain. Margaret's lawyer, Kenneth, was a quiet storm, and as the defense rested their case, it was his turn to dismantle their claims. He stood, calm and confident, his voice steady as he began his counter-arguments. "We are not here to talk about emotional manipulation," Kenneth began, his tone cutting through the air like a razor. "We are here to examine facts. The facts that show Victoria Caldwell's years of manipulation and deceit." He turned to the judge, his eyes piercing as he laid out the first piece of evidence, a series of emails between Victoria and Margaret's business manager. The emails were clear, each one revealing Victoria's repeated attempts to push for financial decisions that would benefit her, often against Margaret's wishes. "Victoria Caldwell has consistently tried to manipulate my client into making decisions that favored her personal interests, not the interests of the family, Kenneth continued. She has used her marriage to James as leverage, attempting to push Margaret into selling the family estate for far less than its value. This is not the behavior of someone seeking what is fair, but someone seeking only to enrich themselves. The courtroom shifted, the tension thickening as Kenneth's words cut through the room. Margaret could see Victoria's face twitch, the first real sign of discomfort from her daughter-in-law. Victoria's carefully constructed image of the doting, respectful wife was beginning to crack. Kenneth continued, calling on witness after witness, people who had worked closely with Victoria, who had seen firsthand her selfishness and entitlement. The picture Kenneth painted was clear, and with every piece of evidence, the facade Victoria had built over the years seemed to crumble further. Victoria's lawyer, realizing the tide was turning, began to flounder. His questions became disjointed, his attempts at redirecting the court growing more frantic. His polished exterior began to show signs of strain as Kenneth pressed harder, pulling apart every claim Victoria had made with ease. Victoria's lawyer's voice faltered under cross-examination, his arguments crumbling in the face of undeniable evidence. The pressure was building, and it was clear to everyone in the room that the case wasn't going in Victoria's favor. As the cross-examination ended, the judge leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "I will make a ruling after reviewing the full testimony," he said, his voice steady, his decision still uncertain. The courtroom fell silent, the air thick with the tension of what was to come. Margaret's heart raced, but she remained still, her eyes fixed on the judge. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something far greater. And whatever the ruling, Margaret knew one thing for sure: the truth was already out there. And that was something no one could take away from her. Victoria and James sat across from Margaret, the weight of the courtroom pressing in around them. The last few hours had been a blur of arguments and evidence, but this was their final attempt. The judge had called for a brief recess, giving everyone a moment to collect their thoughts before the final verdict. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "Please, just listen," she began, her voice trembling with a forced sweetness. "You know this isn't right, Margaret. We're family. You can't just throw that away over a few disagreements. Think about James. Think about what you're doing to him." James, his face pale, looked at Margaret with wide, almost desperate eyes. "Mom, you have to understand. We've been through so much together. This isn't the way things should end. You're tearing this family apart." Margaret sat tall, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She hadn't moved an inch since the argument started. Her gaze never wavered from the judge, even though she could hear the tension in James's voice, the cracks in Victoria's carefully constructed facade. "Family respects each other," Margaret replied coldly, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "You lost that long ago, James." The words hung in the air for a long moment, a chilling silence falling over the room. James looked away, his face a mixture of frustration and pain. Victoria's eyes flashed with fury, but she quickly masked it, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The judge cleared his throat, and everyone's attention snapped back to him. He sat forward, his fingers steepled together as he surveyed the room with a keen eye. The courtroom was still as though holding its breath. "This case has been complicated, to say the least," the judge said, his voice deep and authoritative. "There have been strong arguments on both sides. However, the evidence presented seems to favor the position of Mrs. Caldwell." Margaret's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't allow herself to show any emotion. The words she'd been waiting for were finally coming. Victoria's face twisted in disbelief. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, standing abruptly. "This entire thing has been manipulated from the start. Margaret's been using her power over James to get what she wants. She's been—" "Enough," the judge interrupted, his voice firm and unyielding. "I've heard your claims, but I'm not convinced. There is no clear evidence of manipulation on Mrs. Caldwell's part." Victoria's jaw clenched, but she didn't speak. Her lawyer glanced nervously between them, clearly sensing the tide had shifted. Kenneth, sitting beside Margaret, leaned forward, his voice steady and precise as he made his final statement. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Victoria Caldwell has shown time and time again that her interests were rooted in greed, not respect for this family. It is my client, Margaret Caldwell, who has acted with integrity. Margaret didn't need to say a word. Kenneth had made her case clear. She remained calm, her face impassive, but inside, she could feel a sense of justice settling in. The judge took a long moment, his eyes scanning the papers in front of him. Then, finally, he looked up. "I'm ruling in favor of Margaret Caldwell. The will stands." The words echoed in the courtroom, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. Margaret held her breath, her mind racing as the weight of the decision settled over her. Victoria's face went ashen, and James remained frozen, unable to process what had just happened. But Margaret? She felt a quiet sense of relief. The battle had been long and painful, but in the end, she had triumphed. And now it was time for Victoria to face the consequences of her actions. The gavel hit with a sharp final thud, reverberating through the courtroom like the last note of a funeral march. The judge's ruling was clear. The will stood. Victoria and James were disinherited. The words echoed in Margaret's mind, surreal but undeniable. She had won. The weight of the battle had crushed her in ways she hadn't expected. But now, as she sat motionless in her seat, she felt a strange sense of liberation. Her heart still raced, but the tight knot of anxiety in her chest had loosened. Victoria's face, once full of confidence and entitlement, now resembled that of a person who had just realized they were standing at the edge of an abyss. Her mouth trembled, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked at the judge as if hoping he would reconsider, but the decision had been made. Her lawyer, who had been so sure of victory, now shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking between his client and the judge. Margaret stood and gathered her things, moving with an eerie calm, as if this moment had already been written. She met the eyes of her son, who sat with his head down, his shoulders hunched. The tension between them was palpable, and Margaret could feel the weight of his silent guilt pressing in on her. As they filed out of the courtroom, the cold air of the hallway felt sharp against Margaret's skin. She pulled her coat tighter around her, as if to shield herself from more than just the weather. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the loss of her son's support or the betrayal from the woman who had married him. But as she walked out of that building, she knew one thing: she was free. Back at the family estate, the silence was deafening. Margaret sat in the library, her fingers idly tracing the edge of her wineglass, as she glanced at the phone in her hand. A text message from James had popped up on the screen. It was simple. "I'm sorry, Mom. This went too far." Her gaze lingered on the words, but she didn't respond. Not yet. She couldn't. Not when the wound was still fresh. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said. In the days that followed, the house grew even quieter. Victoria packed her bags, each movement sharp, deliberate, as if she were trying to control the fury and the frustration that swirled within her. She moved through the house with a finality, her footsteps echoing in the once shared spaces. Margaret watched from a distance, but she didn't feel the anger she might have expected. Instead, there was a dull sense of resignation. She wasn't surprised by Victoria's fury. She had seen it before. Victoria had always thought she could have everything. James came to Margaret, his face drawn and pale. "I'm sorry for everything," he said quietly, his voice breaking in places. "I didn't know it would come to this." Margaret didn't flinch. She looked at him, meeting his eyes, the years of unspoken words hanging in the air between them. Finally she spoke, her voice steady but filled with an unexpected peace. "You've apologized. Now live with the consequences." James looked like he wanted to say more, but the words failed him. Instead, he stood there, a broken man, watching as his mother stood tall in the aftermath of it all. Upstairs, Victoria packed her final belongings, each movement sharp with anger, the air thick with tension. She was leaving the family estate for good, and Margaret could almost hear her thoughts, a cocktail of bitterness, shame, and disbelief. Victoria glanced at her phone, but there were no messages from James, no apologies. He had chosen his mother's side, and there was nothing left for her here. With one final glance at the house, she slammed the door behind her, leaving the estate and the family behind. Margaret watched from the window as Victoria's car disappeared down the long driveway. She felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not relief, just a quiet certainty. This chapter was over, the consequences had been set in motion, and as the car's headlights faded into the distance, Margaret knew that this was a turning point, a moment of reckoning for them all. They had tried to steal everything from her, but in the end, it was their own greed that had destroyed them. Victoria's claims had crumbled, her threats evaporating like mist, and James had chosen the wrong side, blindly walking into a future of his own making. But Margaret had stood firm, and now, the legacy that had once been in jeopardy was hers and hers alone. The estate, the wealth, and everything she had worked her entire life to build remained solely in Margaret's name. There was no share for Victoria, no compromise for James, nothing. The will had been read, the papers signed, and now Margaret could finally breathe, knowing that her hard-earned legacy was safe. But she wasn't interested in wealth for the sake of wealth. No, Margaret had other plans. She poured her inheritance into causes she cared deeply about, charities supporting education, women's rights, and the arts, things that mattered, things that would last. It wasn't about leaving a fortune behind. It was about creating a legacy that could stand the test of time. She had worked tirelessly to build her family's name, and now she was using her resources to build something that would benefit others, something meaningful. Victoria, meanwhile, had become a shadow of her former self. Her attempts to reclaim what she had lost fell flat, her efforts fruitless as the legal battles continued to drag on. She had burned every bridge, alienated every ally. No one was willing to help her now, and the weight of her own mistakes was becoming too much to bear. Victoria's arrogance had made her far too easy to expose, and now she was left to face the consequences. James, though, was different. His struggle was quieter, more internal. He had lost more than just money. He had lost his place in his mother's life, and with it, his sense of purpose. Margaret had tried to reach out, but he had pulled away, choosing the path of least resistance, clinging to Victoria as his anchor. Now his financial troubles were mounting, the aftermath of his choices closing in on him like a tightening noose. The business deals had gone sour, and without his inheritance, he had no safety net left to fall back on. But Margaret, she was at peace. The burden of family conflict had lifted, replaced by a quiet calm that she hadn't known in years. There was no one to manipulate her anymore, no one to pull her in different directions. She was free. Kenneth called one afternoon, his voice warm as always. "Margaret, just wanted to check in. The case is officially closed. No further actions. It's done." "Good," Margaret replied, a smile tugging at her lips. "It's over." As she hung up, Margaret sat on the porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the estate. The faint scent of roses lingered in the air, mixing with the earthy smell of freshly cut grass. She rested back in the chair, feeling the cool breeze on her skin. Everything was quiet. Everything was still. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. And as she gazed out over the sprawling estate, Margaret knew that the life she had built, the legacy she had fought for, was hers to protect. Nothing, and no one, could take it from her now. They thought they could break her. They thought their manipulation and lies would be enough to force her into submission. But Margaret had shown them, time and again, that they couldn't control her. And now, as the dust settled, the consequences of their actions were becoming clearer by the day. James and Victoria, once so confident in their entitlement, were now left to rebuild the wreckage of their lives. Victoria's public image had been irreparably tarnished, and James, without the inheritance he had hoped would keep him afloat, found himself floundering. His once solid business ventures were in ruins, and his attempts to re-establish his relationship with Margaret were met with cold resistance. Victoria, still smarting from her fall from grace, moved back into her parents' house. The lavish lifestyle she had enjoyed for so long had disappeared, and she now faced the bitter reality of rebuilding her life from the ground up, something she had never truly been prepared for. She was used to being catered to having everything handed to her, but now she had nothing. Her past attempts to manipulate Margaret and James were exposed for what they were: selfish, deceitful acts, and no amount of money or status could shield her from that truth. James, meanwhile, found his attempts at reconciliation falling flat. He tried to reach out to Margaret, sending texts and making phone calls, but each time, Margaret refused. She had made her decision. He wasn't just apologizing for the inheritance. He was apologizing for years of silence, for his failure to stand by her when she needed him most. But Margaret couldn't forgive him. Not yet. The days slipped into a routine for Margaret. Her neighbors and friends, those who had watched her endure the storm, rallied around her in ways she hadn't expected. They offered her comfort, a listening ear, and the support she had so often given to others. Their kindness was a balm to the wounds that had been opened, and Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest, a quiet gratitude for the people who had remained true. She continued to invest her inheritance into causes that had always been close to her heart, funneling money into local charities, education programs, and initiatives for women's health. It wasn't about the money, it was about making a difference, about leaving a legacy of kindness and compassion rather than bitterness. Margaret found fulfillment in giving back to the community she had always loved. Her days filled with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as she sat with Grace on the back porch, the scent of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery drifting in the warm breeze, Margaret spoke quietly. "I didn't do this for the money," she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "I did it for the respect." Grace nodded, understanding exactly what Margaret meant. She had spent years watching her friend be manipulated, always trying to keep the peace, always giving in for the sake of family, but no more. Margaret had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her future, and now, for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt a peace she had long been denied. The phone rang, jolting Margaret out of her thoughts. She reached for it, and when she saw the name on the screen, her breath caught. It was a reporter. The call was an unexpected twist, the last thing she had expected in this new chapter of her life. "Hello," Margaret answered, her voice steady, despite the pulse of curiosity running through her. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Caldwell," the reporter said, his voice polite but professional. "We've been following your case, and I'd like to offer you an opportunity for an interview about your victory. Would you be interested in speaking with us about the journey and the lessons learned?" Margaret paused, the weight of the question hanging in the air. She had never been one for the spotlight, but now, standing on the precipice of a new chapter, perhaps it was time to share her story. She glanced out over the porch, the same garden she had nurtured for years now bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun. She felt a quiet strength building within her. "Let's talk," she said, her voice calm yet resolute. And in that moment, Margaret knew that her story, her legacy, was finally being told on her own terms. Victoria's message arrived late in the evening, a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. Her words were carefully crafted, a blend of apology and guilt, with an undertone of urgency. "Margaret, I know we've been through a lot, but I hope we can find a way to move forward. I've made mistakes, but I want to make things right. Please, let's talk." Margaret stared at the message for a long moment, the screen glowing softly in the dim light of her living room. She could almost hear Victoria's voice in her head, the familiar mix of sweetness and manipulation. But this time, Margaret felt nothing. No anger, no desire to respond, just a quiet resolve. She didn't respond. She wouldn't. The years of manipulation, the insults veiled as concern, the constant tug-of-war between family loyalty and personal dignity. It had all come to a head. Margaret had made her choice, and nothing, not even Victoria's hollow words, could sway her now. James wasn't far behind. His message was simple, apologetic, an attempt to reclaim what had been lost. "I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know how it got this far, but I never wanted things to be this way. I wish I could take it all back." Margaret's hand hovered over the phone for a moment. She had once wanted to heal the rift between them, to have the kind of relationship she'd always dreamed of. But she had been chasing something that had never truly existed. It wasn't his apology that hurt. It was the years of inaction, the years of silence while Victoria played her games. She deleted the message without a second thought. Peace had never come from appeasing others. It came from standing firm in her own truth. The weight of the past few months settled around Margaret like a blanket as she stepped into the garden the next morning, the crisp air filling her lungs. The garden, once a place where she had spent hours tending to her flowers with the hope of cultivating beauty, now felt like a space of freedom. The birds were chirping, the scent of roses mixed with fresh earth, and the sun, still low in the sky, cast a golden glow over everything. This was her space, her sanctuary. The wind brushed lightly against her skin, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt light. She was free from the toxic hold of her son and daughter-in-law. She had taken back her life. Her friends, those who had supported her through the storm, praised her decision to cut ties. "You've done what needed to be done, Margaret," Grace said one evening as they sat on the porch sipping wine. "You took control. That's the hardest part." Margaret smiled, the weight of the decision still heavy but now laced with satisfaction. She had finally stopped living in the shadows of others' expectations. With her newfound sense of freedom, Margaret channeled her energy into something meaningful, a project she had always dreamed of but had never had the time to start. A foundation dedicated to empowering women and supporting local communities. She poured herself into it, feeling the spark of purpose reignite within her. This was the legacy she would leave, not just wealth, but a tangible difference in the world. The foundation's first donation was made, and it was already gaining attention. Margaret could feel the excitement building. This was her true legacy, one forged from resilience and compassion, not from the betrayal of those she loved. As she stood on the porch, looking out over the estate, a quiet sense of pride settled over her. She had made her choice, and it had been the right one. And as the foundation was named in her honor, Margaret smiled softly. The legacy she had fought so hard to protect was now taking root, one that would grow long after she was gone. The foundation, once just an idea, was now thriving. It had gained traction faster than Margaret had imagined, its programs flourishing in the arts, education, and women's empowerment, areas she had always believed in deeply. The local community embraced her efforts, and soon the impact spread beyond her expectations. Scholarships were being funded, creative spaces were being built, and the lives of women who had been overlooked for so long were starting to change. Margaret had set out to make a difference, but what she'd created was a legacy that would continue to shape lives for generations. As the foundation grew, Margaret's satisfaction didn't come from the accolades or the growing bank balance. It came from the people whose lives were being transformed. She had money, yes, but it wasn't the money that defined her success. It was the way her work had rippled through the community, the way it inspired change. She felt a quiet joy watching a young artist speak at one of the gallery openings, or seeing a woman step into a boardroom for the first time, filled with confidence and purpose. This was the success she'd always dreamed of, the success she'd built without the toxic influence of her past. The media soon took notice. Headlines in local papers began to call her the reformed matriarch, a title Margaret had never anticipated. They praised her courage, her strength in rising above the personal betrayals, and her dedication to shaping the future. To them, Margaret was an example of resilience, a woman who had turned a painful chapter into a force for good. She was featured in interviews and articles, a symbol of reinvention, but she didn't gloat. In fact, she avoided the spotlight when she could, preferring to stay in the background, letting her work speak for itself. Meanwhile, James continued to struggle. His financial situation was worsening by the day. His business was in shambles, his investments had failed, and without the cushion of Margaret's inheritance, he was left trying to pick up the pieces of a life he had taken for granted. But more than that, James was emotionally adrift. He had never learned to stand on his own, to make decisions without leaning on others, and now he was reaping the consequences of his inaction. Victoria, too, had fallen from the high pedestal she once stood on. She had moved back in with her parents, her life far removed from the one she had once imagined. The lavish lifestyle she had been accustomed to was gone, replaced by an uncertainty she wasn't prepared for. No longer could she control those around her with her charm and manipulation. She had to face the reality of who she was and what she had become. But Margaret, for all her success, never looked back. She didn't dwell on the past. didn't hold on to resentment. She simply kept moving forward, building the future she had always wanted. Her days were filled with meetings, events, and planning for the next phase of her foundation. She was a woman who had learned from the past and was now paving a path for others to follow. One afternoon, as Margaret sat at her desk reviewing a new grant proposal, the sound of the doorbell rang through the house. She stood and opened the door to find an envelope waiting for her. It was from one of the charities she had supported for years, a well-known organization that had been close to her heart. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. "Dear Mrs. Caldwell," the letter began, "we are honored to extend an invitation to you as the keynote speaker at our upcoming gala. Your commitment to creating lasting change has inspired so many, and we would be privileged to have you share your story with our guests." Margaret read the words again, feeling a sense of disbelief wash over her. The invitation was both an honor and a sign that her efforts were being recognized at a much higher level. She smiled quietly, her heart swelling with pride. The legacy she had built was now undeniable, and it was only just beginning. But just as she set the letter down, a sudden thought flickered in her mind. What was next? What challenges lay ahead? She had built something strong, but the future was still unwritten. And somewhere, far from her peaceful retreat, someone was plotting their next move. The spotlight was bright as Margaret stepped onto the stage, the hum of the crowd fading into silence. She could feel the weight of the moment, the energy in the room buzzing like electricity. It was the annual charity gala, the one that had been in the works for months, and tonight she was the keynote speaker. The foundation she had built, the legacy that had once been in jeopardy, was now flourishing. The room was filled with people who admired her strength, her resilience, and the impact she had made. Margaret stood tall, her heart steady but filled with anticipation. She had spent years watching others shape their own futures, watching them control their destinies through manipulation or privilege. Now it was her turn. She took a deep breath, and with a calmness that resonated through every word, she began. "Good evening," she started, her voice clear, strong, and unwavering. "When I first set out on this journey, I had no idea the kind of challenges I'd face, the forces that would try to take everything I had. But I realized something important along the way. No one can take your legacy from you unless you let them. The only person who truly controls your future is you." The audience was silent, captivated. Margaret's words hung in the air, as powerful as they were simple. She spoke of the struggles she had faced, the pain of betrayal, and the strength she had discovered within herself to rebuild. She spoke of the women she had met along the way, of the young girls who had found their voices through her foundation, and of the responsibility she felt to ensure that those voices were heard long after she was gone. "They tried to take everything from me," she continued, her eyes scanning the crowd, her voice steady with conviction. "But I gave myself everything they could never touch, my peace, my purpose. And now I want you all to know, it's yours for the taking." As she finished, the room erupted into applause, but Margaret only felt the quiet pride of knowing she had done what she had set out to do, made an impact, shared her story, and left others inspired to fight for their own futures. In the days that followed, the foundation continued to thrive, its influence growing every day. Margaret lived her life free from the drama that had once consumed her. She woke each morning with purpose, knowing that she had created something real, something that would outlast any betrayal or hardship. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret stood in her garden, watching the sky turn from gold to a deep violet. The scent of jasmine filled the air, the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze was a calming sound, and for the first time in years, she truly felt at peace. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the silence. She glanced at it, seeing James's name. Her heart didn't flutter, didn't soften. He had called before, offering apologies, hoping to rekindle what was lost. But tonight Margaret knew it was too late now. With a soft exhale, she rejected the call. She wasn't angry, no. She had moved beyond that. She had moved beyond the past. Her future was in her hands, and no one, not even her son, could take that from her. She continued to mentor young women, helping them find their strength and voice, guiding them as she had guided herself. She felt the weight of peace settle over her, a quiet contentment filling her every day. As she gazed out at the fading light, a soft smile played on her lips. They tried to take everything from me, she whispered to herself, but they never took my peace. And with that, Margaret knew no one would ever have the power to take that from her again.